Good morning. It's good to see all of you today. I started to give you a big mini Pearl howdy, but I decided not to do that. But we are glad to see everybody today, and we are proud to be here. It's where we ought to be every Lord's Day, and we appreciate the fact that you see it the same way. We're going to begin with a prayer. Brother Steve is going to lead us in prayer.
Our God and Father in heaven, we humbly bow before Thee this day to give Thee thanks. We're thankful, Father, for this day. We're thankful for this opportunity we have to assemble ourselves together to study Thy holy and divine will. We're so thankful, Father, for this congregation. We're thankful for our elders. We're thankful for our Bible class teachers. We pray Thy richest blessings on each of them, Father. We're thankful for Brother Dick and his ability to lead this class. We pray that he will speak boldly and plainly that we all may understand. We're mindful, Father, that we have members that out on the road. We pray that You will watch over them and bring them back to be with us. Be with each of us, Father, as we go into this class. Forgive us when we stumble. For in Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Amen. Thank you for that prayer. Well, in our studies on culture and what's going on in society and how we as Christians are to deal with that, of course, our position is unique. It's not one of violence or any kind of force. It's one of love, but at the same time, and as Steve prayed, that we do so with boldness and plainness of speech without being ugly about it. But there are a lot of issues that we've had to face and are facing today. Coming up in this next lesson, we'll be talking about racism. That's a topic that's dealt with in the Bible, and we need to find out what the Bible has to say about that. But we're going to pick up where we left off last time. We got down to number 7 on page 21. And the last one, so we were talking about that when our time ran out. So we'll pick up talking about that one today. How does the secular agenda affect politics in the following areas? And the first one is sexuality. How does it affect it? What is the prevailing attitude toward it? And as it relates to government? Jim?
Prevailing attitude is that there are not two genders, that each person is able to identify sexually according to their own self-proclaimed sexual identity, which they have counted currently. There are 127 sexual identities that have been mentioned.
Okay, that's quite a few. I don't know what all of them are. I don't know how to get that many out of it, but
That's a long way from two.
long way from two, isn't it? That's the main thing. All we need to know is what the Bible teaches. We don't have to know what the world thinks so far as that's concerned, because they're all over the place, and that can change from one day to the next. But the idea is that sexuality is morally neutral, anything goes. I think that pretty well explains it. And it was just a few years ago that our White House was lit up in rainbow colors to celebrate that as the law changed and the Supreme Court sanctioned it. But that doesn't mean we as Christians cannot live in this society anymore. So far, we still can. And we still can stand for our principles until they start making laws that you can't talk about that. There have been movements in that direction to say what you can or cannot say, not so much as making laws, but you're terribly ridiculed. We saw that recently regarding the football kicker for the Kansas City Chiefs and what he said at the Catholic University about the role of women and what the Bible teaches on that. He's been severely ridiculed for that. And so there's a movement to try to silence any kind of views like that. You're ridiculed and put down and denied certain privileges. Things change. and it affects your social life as well in a lot of ways. The second part of that, the B part, what is their expectation for the end of the world?
Global warming and big crumb.
Global warming and what?
Big crumb.
I didn't catch what you said on the last. What?
Big crumb. Inflation. All that coming together.
Oh, okay, yeah. One thing we don't need to do here, and that is confuse scientists with actual science. Not all scientists are honest. According to science, not all preachers are honest. We understand that. That's true in any category. But we don't need to confuse what a scientist may say in giving his opinion, although he may be dogmatic about it, and what science itself tells us. And we've seen a lot of peer pressure involved in this subject of sexuality. Just a few years ago, the American Psychological Association was saying that it is a mental illness and that people need treatment for it. And today, we're told, don't follow the science, follow the person, what the person's opinion is about that, their feelings. And so we cast aside the science to it, the genetic part of it. There aren't many different genders genetically. And we see a lot of false predictions taking place regarding some scientists. And as he mentioned, the global warming, and that the glaciers melting and flooding the earth. Well, a bunch of them have melted and the earth hadn't been flooded. There's been very little difference in our tides during that time, and they've been relatively unaffected. So some who spoke dogmatically on that subject so far have been wrong. And so we don't need to confuse true science with what a scientist may say, any more than we confuse the Bible with what some preacher may say. I think we can understand that, because scientists are not infallible, preachers are not infallible. But we trust the Word of God that it is. Any other comments about Lesson 2 before we move to Lesson 3? John?
I was going to say, the point that you're making, what it boils down to is we're going to have to do the homework on our own, whether it's the Bible or whether it's science, because science gets misrepresented just the same as the Bible gets misrepresented. For example, one of the things that they say is going to be so bad about the greenhouse effect and us destroying the ozone layer, it has to do with radiation. And we've been taught that radiation is bad, we'll die from it, and there are a lot of experiments that show a little bit of radiation, like we're getting from the earth all the time, is actually good for us. And so we're going to have to weed through all that, just like we have to weed through various doctrines that are being taught.
Well, that's true, and sometimes Christians get ridiculed for making statements that are contrary to science, and we need to be careful in that area too. But we also need to recognize that science is limited to the physical world. It has no authority to speak on things regarding love and patience and kindness. That's something that can't be measured scientifically. So science doesn't have all the answers to everything. It just can deal with the physical world. And so there are a lot of things that science doesn't deal with. It doesn't deal with morality, except that it says whatever you do in a moral way or expresses love or anything like that was just a chemical reaction in your brain, because there's no God to cause you to do that. That's what the bottom line of that is. I didn't add one other thing. I mentioned the American Psychological Association. At one time, they were opposed to giving kids treatment, drugs and things like that to go along with their preference and what gender they claim to be, and surgeries and things like that. They were opposed to that. But now they kind of have backed away from that. And what's prevailing is the individual's feelings take precedence over what science tells us genetically, that there's just male and female, and what the Bible tells us genetically, or male and female. So on that, true science and the Bible are together on that. But we've got a new avenue in there of a person's feelings. I can't think of any other problem dealing with human beings that is treated that way. We don't treat anorexia that way, although it's in the person's mind. The anorexic person sees themselves as being grossly overweight, and so they stop eating, and they end up making themselves sick, and some people have died from it. In fact, I know a person that did, and it's a problem in the mind there, that they're seeing one thing when they look in the mirror that's not reality. And we don't treat that and say, well, if this person feels like they're fat, then they're fat. Well, no, we don't say that. We say they need help. And there's nothing wrong with saying that. And if a person needs help, there's nothing wrong with seeking it. And they certainly should do that. But this other matter that involves sexuality is treated totally the opposite. And we see that. Okay, the next lesson, lesson 3, there is a God. And you always want to follow that with, He is alive, since that's the way we sing it. And it's a good song. It's interesting that there are people today who are called nuns, not N-U-N-S, but N-O-N-E-S. What's that mean in our society today? They have no religious affiliation whatever. They're nuns.
They don't believe in anything.
Not very much, except that they have the right to do that.
Yeah.
In one poll, 28% people listed themselves as nuns, and 17% as actual atheists, 20% as agnostics, and 63% as nothing in particular. That's kind of like the nuns, seems to me. And that was the Pew Research that did that. And so we see there's been a change, a pretty big change there. And we're living in a different world today than we were 40, 50 years ago. So he starts out by telling us that an atheist is someone who doesn't believe in God. Only 4% of Americans openly say that they're atheists. And the key word there is openly. There are a number of them that say it and are not as open about it until you get on Facebook, and then you see it. You say, well, this is not 4% when you see that. But that's a whole lot more than what they were saying 15 years ago. So the number is increasing, and they've become organized, and they're active for the last few years. They've done advertising on the city buses in Little Rock. That's been going on, the Atheist Society has. And they have their annual conventions and things of that kind. And they had it in Memphis a few years ago. And every year they have it somewhere else, if the Lord wills. And so they have their Atheist Society and build each other up, and they're getting organized in doing that and working together. And of course, that makes a problem for us because they're trying to influence our school system and everything else. And so our children need to be aware of these conflicts that they're likely to face going through the public school system. And while we don't want to terrorize them with the worst case scenario, we do need to make them alert, make them aware. And blessings on all parents who are dealing with that in today's world. I'm glad that we're not now raising children. And of course, we still have to think about it in regard to our grandchildren, but not as much influence there. But these are some genuine problems that Christians are facing and will be facing in the near future as we see the world changing, as the world turns, I used to say. Let's look at the questions on page 31. This is the longest lesson in the book, I believe, covers several pages, and so we won't be able to finish it, I don't believe, in one time. We'll talk some more about it, but it's worth spending time on it, because this is the basis for our faith and our behavior. The fact is that we believe there is a God and that He is alive. What effect is the rising secularism having on your family and the church? And how many of our children are walking away from the church when they reach adulthood? Two questions. Let's take the first one there. How is the effect of rising secularism affecting your family? And it may be the answer in that second part there. Hardly any family has not been affected, have they? I see it in my grandchildren. I have some grandchildren that have left the church and seeking other things. And so we see them walking away. Naturally, we want to do a self-examination, but we also want to see the big picture of what's going on and how they're being affected, and the number of different things that affect them. Peer pressure and society itself, secular society, the cell phone, those are things that are involved. And in the past 10 years, Stone Ridge Congregation has lost a large number of young people to the world and to other things. And that's something we can't bury our heads over. We need to take a look at that. Try to figure out, is there anything we can do? And it may be too late in some of those cases, but we need to think about that as regards the future, because we need to make sure that doesn't become a trend. And so we need to guard ourselves there.
Never too late. If there's life, it's never too late.
Never too late as long as there's life. That's true. And we continue to pray. We ought not minimize the need and the benefits of prayer.
One particular stat here that impresses me, this is important. This is not about question one directly, but it might relate to it. We're told that Russia has only 4% who say they're atheists.
Yeah.
Now there is a country where atheism was taught to the babies almost, for at least 2 generations, until finally they threw out the communist system. But now with Putin, I suppose secularism is taking over in Russia too, in an official sort of in their educational institutions and their government. But it's amazing how many of those Russians whose parents and grandparents and maybe great-grandparents had atheism stuffed into them. Maybe there's something there that might say something to us too.
Well, I think that's a good observation, because that is true. I mean, the Soviet Union, it was compelled nearly, and anybody that believed in God, of course, was in trouble with society and all of that. And it was forced even in the school system. It was an official government position. So it wasn't just something, opinion floating around. And yet a small number of atheists. So it shows that people can believe in God if they want to, and that the government cannot stop that. Nobody can stop you from believing what you believe, not even the government. They may force you to behave in a certain way, but they can't change what you think and believe.
Brother Bill,
Yes, Brother Robert?
we study throughout the Bible, the Old Testament and New Testament as well, where throughout the ages, from time to time, the people of God turn away from Him for maybe several generations, but they have a tendency to come back to Him whenever they get woke up. And so situations like Brother Almond is referring to here, we can't give up. We may have a generation that has a tendency to really go away from God, but if we don't give up, we may have the next generation may turn back to Him. So we've got to keep that in the forefront of our mind and keep working.
Well, that's true. We see different things happening in history, sometimes a pattern to it. As we think about Russia And there are now, I say several conservative congregations existing in Russia, several for them, it wouldn't be several for us. But in spite of the attempt to stamp out religion, that hasn't worked, and we see now what's going on there. And in some ways, the Russian government, what they stand for in the moral realm, is more conservative than what the United States stands for. They haven't sanctioned same-sex marriage in Russia, and it's still considered immoral to practice that. And so that's one difference, and you have to wonder about that. With their background in atheism, how did they arrive where they are? And that's a head-scratcher. I don't have the answers to all that. I saw a hand, another hand. Oh, yes, Alma.
Along also with what Bob is saying, Jesus says in Revelation to the church of Philadelphia that you have a little strength. He says, but I am going to open and no man can shut. And what I shut, no man can open. And you're going to be beneficiaries of that.
Yeah. Well, that's interesting. Like Brother Robert said too, we can't give up because things can change, people can change. If we didn't believe that, we wouldn't be preaching the gospel. If they can't change, there'd be no point in preaching. Number two, why is an atheist unable to prove there is no God?
Because he's everywhere.
You what?
Because he's everywhere. They can't prove he doesn't exist because they can't find where he's at.
Okay. Now, some atheists are more clever. They won't say that there is no God. They will say they don't see any evidence of one, so they don't believe in him, because they don't want to have to affirm a negative, that there isn't something, that something doesn't exist. And so they become more clever in that, in some of the discussion things that I'm on. But if you affirm something to be true, the burden of proof is on you, isn't it? If you hold an affirmative position, so they don't want to take an affirmative position saying we know that there is no God, because they can't know that, but they say we don't see any evidence of one, therefore we don't believe in one. So that's a little different twist they're putting on it now. And so the proof is on them if they say that.
They don't think of the woman that has this child or anything like that. That's just natural. And it's not God-given.
Yeah, when you look at, some call it the miracle of birth. It's not a miracle, but it's a marvelous thing, no less. It's a part of God's law of reproduction. But we're pointing out earlier, science just deals with one aspect of things, and a lot of atheists try to make a God out of science. Science is the only thing we need to know about. It has all the answers, and they trust in science. But science only deals with the physical realm, as we pointed out. And there's a whole other realm that it doesn't deal. Science deals with the natural realm. It cannot deal with the supernatural. That's not its realm of concentration. So science can't tell us anything about the supernatural. And we need to understand that. And let me see if I can read my writing here. Well, I've said that science is not God, but some act as though it is. And scientists are not always logical. They are not always honest. And several things we could say about that. And that's been proven by history. I mean, the Piltdown Man. The Piltdown Man shows that some people were dishonest in the field of science. And they got away with that for about 25 years. Of thinking that the Piltdown Man was evidence of human evolution, when the whole thing was fake from the start, and it got into the dictionary as a fact that it was evidence of evolution. And some people even wrote their PhD thesis on the Piltdown Man, which turned out to be a hoax and was purposely hoax. It was intentional dishonesty. That's what it was. And there have been others too. In fact, of course, I feel that way about all the so-called missing links. Not so much that people are dishonest, but that they don't have the evidence. When you can, for example, the Heidelberg Man, the evidence for him is one jawbone. and the rest of him is plaster of Paris. They take that jawbone, they take plaster of Paris and imagine what the rest of him looked like, and then they draw pictures of him with flesh and with hair and different bodily features. That's all guesswork. And when kids see that in a textbook and they see these pictures, they think, well, look what they found. They didn't find that. They found one jawbone. And the rest of it is their imagination. And I have a picture of where several different artists looked at the same thing and drew what they thought this person looked like. There were 5 different ones. And every one of them had a picture. All 5 pictures were totally different. So that's just an opinion, what they look like when you add flesh and hair and all that to them. And children need to be aware of that. They don't need to see that in their textbook and say, well, look what the evidence is. That's not evidence. That's guesswork. Yes, Almond?
We're talking about the limitations of science. Science can deal with something which is only testable, coming up with a hypothesis and then testing it to see whether the hypothesis, seems to stand, and repeat it. If it's not repeatable you can't call it scientific.
That's right. And the Big Bang is not any of those, is it? It's not repeatable. It's not testable. There were no eyewitnesses. Yes, John?
And in addition to being dishonest, sometimes science is simply mistaken. The fellow that came up with the lobotomy to drive an instrument into a person's head to alter their behavior was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. It's discredited by the Neurological Society now.
Yeah.
So they were just wrong.
Yeah, they were wrong. And the same for preachers. A preacher may be wrong without being dishonest, but some are. And so we've got to understand that people in all realms of life fit these different descriptions. And also it fails to recognize that some things are proven by history. Yes.
Another thing that you were talking about there a few minutes ago about the one jawbone and all the rest of that being make-believe. We as human beings have allowed for years a terrible, terrible mistake to occur. We've allowed it to be drilled into our head. If there's something, a picture, or if there's wording in a book, it's bound to be true, and that's not right. And we've allowed that to be accepted for so long, that kids see a picture in a textbook, and if we don't tell them it's wrong and explain to them why it's wrong, they accept that as fact, and there's where a lot of the problems come in.
Well, you're right. That's true. Sandra?
On the other hand, I think we have to teach them in all aspects. There's no telling how many people come in and say, well, I read it on the internet, so this must be true. And that's not the case. And I think most scientists do believe in God, and that you see the few that are cheaters or liars. That's in everything. That's not just scientists. And I think God, through science, proves himself to be. If you look at golden ratios and things of that nature in mathematics, God created all that as his proof that he is here.
Well, that's right. I believe science is really on the side of the Bible, true science. But we don't need to confuse a scientist with true science any more than we need to confuse a preacher with the Bible. The Bible is right. Preachers can be wrong.
Or the internet as a medical master or something like that. The internet doesn't tell everything about medicine either.
Yeah, don't do that, especially with using AI apparently telling people to go jump off the bridge.
Yeah. Yeah. So we understand that people are fallible, and we believe the Bible to be infallible. Yes, I'm sorry.
I bought a book a few years ago. Of course, I don't now know what few years ago means to me right now, but a few years ago, written by a dentist. He was really an outstanding dentist, but he believe in creation, etc. And he would read these reports about bones of Neanderthal man. So he decided to take off a whole year to travel around where supposedly a university or someplace had a few bones that were Neanderthal. And what he found out, he got absolutely no cooperation. It was very difficult for him ever to be able to look at and see really what was there. And himself, make notes about it. In fact, he got threatened, and often some tried to kill him because they were afraid he was going to expose that the Neanderthal bones didn't really mean what was being published.
Well, that's interesting. That happened just a few years ago. A scientist lost his job. He got fired because he gave evidence of flesh found in a dinosaur. He uncovered a dinosaur bed, and some of the part of the dinosaur still had flesh attached, which shows that it hadn't been dead that long. And so he got in trouble for that, but finally he got his job back. He sued and won because they had no basis for firing him when he admitted there was soft tissue there, because there was. They couldn't deny it. Next question, number 3. While appreciating the accomplishments of science, why is science unable to speak authoritatively about the existence or non-existence of God?
Because he's everywhere all the time, I can't bear a word that.
Okay. As we said a while ago, science only deals with the natural, the physical, doesn't it? And not supernatural things. It doesn't deal with that. So they may say, we haven't found evidence in the natural world. We're not saying there's evidence in the natural world that Christ was resurrected. But in the eyewitnesses and their record, there's evidence, historical records. People accept all kinds of things based on history that's recorded about people they never saw. They didn't see Abraham Lincoln. They didn't see George Washington. They didn't see Napoleon. They didn't see any of these historical characters that we believe in. In fact, some people that I've been in discussion with will argue about some of the ancient authors. They'll try to say, well, the Bible copied off of so-and-so Greek god of some kind. And yet they believe that that author lived. And yet there's less evidence that he lived than there is that Moses lived. And so they're inconsistent on that. Number 4, why are science textbooks ever changing?
Because me and R.
What's that?
Because me and R.
Okay. Can we say science textbooks are evolving?
No, it's supposed to change because science is supposed to be about the search for the truth.
Okay.
And if you're searching for the truth, ever and ever closer approximations of the truth, you need to go back and update yourself every now and then.
Exactly.
And that's how it's supposed to be.
That's right. So new information is constantly being discovered that has to be assessed, and sometimes it takes a while to study it. You can't just make a snap decision. But sometimes that new information sets aside old ideas that were believed at one time. In fact, if you'll notice on the bottom of page 24, and the bottom of that first column there, that's discussed. We'll turn there and look right quick. So it says, science is ever increasing its knowledge. What was frontline research in the 1830s is now debunked. Bloodletting was once thought to be a medical cure. It is claimed to have been most common medical practice performed by surgeons from antiquity until the late 19th century. Bloodletting is thought to be the cause of President George Washington's death. They did put leeches on him. I've heard of a few cases of that being practiced today, but it's not a wide practice.
It's not, it can be used today, but not for very many things.
Yeah, it's not for very many things.
What do you know, they got it right once or twice like a broken clock.
Yeah, there are probably better medical means of doing that than with leeches. That can be done in other ways too. How does the existence of the universe, number 5, how does the existence of the universe give evidence to the existence of God?
Something cannot be created from nothing.
Okay, that's right. Something can't come from nothing, and no other explanation is adequate. How in the world is the Big Bang an adequate explanation for the universe that we have in all the universes out there, all the different solar systems? How does that work?
So you bring up an interesting thing here, because earlier we said that science wouldn't be able to authoritatively speak on the existence of God, right?
Yeah.
But if that's true, then we can't say that the world itself in the physical realm proves the existence of God either, because that's what science examines all the time. And so I really do think that science probably can authoritatively say that God exists if they look at what exists in nature and try to determine what is a sufficiently explainable cause.
Well, that's true, and the Bible makes that argument that nature, in Romans chapter 1, says that, well, let's just read it. Romans 1. In fact, I think that verse is coming up here. Romans 1:18. Yeah, well, let's wait till we get to it. It's down in question 6. We'll get to Romans 1. But the Bible says looking at the creation is evidence.
And along with what Jonathan is saying, if we admit that everything is a universe, no matter how many separate systems it has within it, no matter how many solar systems, if it's all basically one cosmos and not chaos, then that's design, that's intelligence. And so, standpoint of what Jonathan is saying, you can then extrapolate that God, only a God would be able to do that.
That's true. And another thing here, not only can you prove some things by history, you can also prove things by logic. And sometimes logic gets cast out the window here.
And mathematics too.
That's true. And so when you think about that,
As complex as the universe is, common sense will tell anyone that has any common sense that it cannot happen by accident.
that's true. And as we mentioned, it only deals with the physical realm. Science can't explain why people have a conscience. Everybody has one. Sometimes they get trained in reverse and they work the opposite because they weren't trained right. They have to be trained. But there's a certain sense that everybody has of what you ought to do or ought not to do. Things that should be done, things that shouldn't be done. Everybody has that sense. How can you explain that with evolution? You can't. It's outside the realm of evolution that deals with the thought process, all that. Well, our question, how does the existence of the universe give evidence of the existence of God? And we've answered that no other explanation is adequate. Eventually, it gets out of the realm of explaining things by science and guesswork like the Big Bang Theory. Well, this doesn't work. How many explosions can you think of that result in a higher degree of order? And every one of them I can think of result in disorder. When I look at the bombs that we dropped on Japan and the disorder there, and for years people have suffered the consequences of that from the radiation. And look at the space shuttle Challenger that crashed, that exploded. How much order came out of that? We're still mourning the loss of life from that. I can't think of any explosion that results in a higher degree of order, but most of the time of disorder, or all the time of disorder. And so when you realize how small they say it was, the thing that exploded, I have a picture of it. I should have made it so I could show it on the screen. Picture of how small they say it was, and that's not an exaggeration right there. And that little thing exploded, and it resulted in life and all the solar systems that you see and all the natural things, and different animals and different creatures we see on there, all the different planets, just from that one little thing. And they don't believe in miracles. Talk about a miracle, that's a big one there. Yes.
And also, these made them mad and we didn't even know it, just because we're too noisy. But when Paul was at Lystra, he said God did not leave himself without witness, and that he did good and gave us rain, and he fills our hearts with food and gladness. Now, he really is concerned about doing good to us.
Yeah. And the things I've read about many of the Greek gods and goddesses, many of them were very immoral. They were thinking only about themselves and not anybody else. And some of the bizarre things that they did are just unthinkable to us, but we won't get into all that. Our next question, explain the biblical arguments for the existence of God drawn from the following passages. Psalm 19, 1 through 6. That's the one that begins, how? The heavens declare the glory of God, and the firmament showeth his handiwork. Day unto day uttereth speech, and night unto night showeth knowledge. There is no speech nor language where their voice is not heard. Doesn't matter what language you speak. All of us, all around the world, I don't know how many hundreds of thousands of languages there are, but in all those languages, we can all see the same evidence when we look at the firmament. And we can see that. And so we've kind of got a figure of speech here where human qualities are ascribed to the creation. And it says that day unto day uttereth speech, and night unto night uttereth knowledge. It's showing us knowledge. It's saying something to us by its existence. And we're expected to logically look at that and say, here's the conclusion that I draw. There has to be a God.
And it happens over and over, the day and night happen over and over according to a pattern. That's design. I mean, anybody can observe that.
Yeah, they can even predict what time sunrise and sunset occur. And recently, when we experienced the eclipse of the sun, they could precisely predict when that was going to happen several years in advance. They predicted the next one for 20 years from now, and very precise in it. They could only do that if there's a pattern to it, and if there's design in it. And not only, we're just one solar system. There's several other solar systems out there that have the same thing going on, precisely. And scientists have discovered that. When you look at all those things, that's piling the evidence on. There has to be an intelligent designer there to do that. So when they looked at the heavens and they saw something there, and the Bible says this is a logical thing to do, to look at the heavens and draw this conclusion. And so we ask, how did those things get up there? When you think of all the different constellations up there, that's our second bell, right? Well, let's stop there and pick up there next time. Still talk some more about Psalm 19, because I've got some more I want to say about that, and you may have too.